Hi there, I'm Jason Bulmahn, Director of Game Design at Paizo and creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game. In today's Design Musing, I want to talk to you about math and how it equates to the feel and the verisimilitude of your game. So at its heart, most games are about math, right? It may not seem obvious at first, but when you dig into most games, there's some math hiding underneath the surface. Even games as simple as checkers have a math formula floating around underneath them. Obviously, when you get to more complicated games, like role-playing games, math comes to the forefront. The way that math expresses itself is critical to how many games play. So when you're designing a game of your own, looking at the math of your game, stripping away the kind of veneer of the game itself and just looking at the math system is kind of a critical component of designing your game. The math and the chances behind a character's success drives that character. It defines kind of what the players can and can't do in the world. On the same token, it also defines the world itself. How difficult and challenging the world is says a lot about the setting of the game. The way that the characters interact with that world and the way that their chances and their math progresses over time defines a character's sense of progress, their sense of change, the journey that they have as they play a game. So we should probably start by breaking down how the math actually works in your game. On one side, you have the players, and they are defined by their various attributes and qualities. For the games that I've worked on, that's things like level and ability score, their skills or proficiency, their gear, what kind of magic they have available to them. All of these things contribute to their math formula. You know, at its basics, it's like, well, your level adds to your ability to do things. That's the most base progression. But there's so many other layers on top of that. You know, just thinking about how you get a better and better magic sword is an expression of the math of the game. That allows you to do bigger and greater things. So understanding that and understanding when you give those levers and when those things come into play is part of your kind of build of the math of your world. On the world side itself, you have the challenges of the environment and the creatures that dwell within it. And that is the other side of this formula. So on one side you have the protagonists, on the other side you have the antagonists, and how their number formulas interact really is what defines your game. So on the world side you have environmental dangers and how those scale up over time. You have challenges that might be comparable to one another, you know, like the difficulty in, you know, climbing a old cobbled stone wall for low levels might be entirely different in scale to trying to climb a smooth iron wall of some keep of some fire elemental lord, right? So those sorts of challenges speak to the nature of the game world just by their comparison to one another. And then, of course, there's the most obvious element of the world's math, which is the monsters and the foes that inhabit it, and how they scale in power and how they grow in aptitude and ability really says a lot about what the nature of your world is and the challenges that live within it. All of this, of course, you know, when you put these two pieces together, how the players interact with that, how their numbers interact with the world numbers, talks about their current game state, their current place and position. And how those numbers change over time speaks to their journey through that world, through that narrative. So the more that those numbers change and how they change and when they change says a lot about the narrative and the world structure of the game you're trying to build. You know, as they go up in level and newer threats become possible and older threats become less challenging, that speaks to their power and progress, right? I think it's easy for us to understand at first level you start by fighting orcs, and then, you know, at higher levels you end up fighting giants, and then demons, and then dragons, right? And that speaks to your journey as an adventurer. Those higher level threats were outside your range started, and orcs were still a dangerous challenge. But as you go up in level and the orcs become less of a challenge, and all of a sudden giants become your new challenge, that speaks to your growth as a hero in that world, in that setting. So that is at its heart what I'm trying to get at here, that math equates to a journey, that the change in math, the change in the relationship of the formulas, is kind of one of the ways we tell a narrative inside a game structure. The trick is getting this all to feel right. And this is a really nebulous thing, and it's probably one of the harder things that we have to do, because the feel isn't something that you can just point to a formula on a board and say, ta-da, we have solved it. It's something that you have to test and work at and try to get right. So you have a lot of levers at your disposal when you're designing a game, right? And you kind of have to use all of them to make the game feel the way you want it to feel. On one side, you have the world and its challenges, right? And that presents a lot of levers, right? Not just those iron walls on keeps or those monsters, but a lot of different ways that those things can scale up over time. So, for example, if you were trying to make a game about superheroes, you might have the initial curve of challenges be very, very, very steep to represent kind of leaving the mundane world behind. Those very first challenges are things that ordinary people deal with, you know, crooks and bank robbers and simple things. But it ramps out of that very quickly to get into the realm of what superheroes can deal with, you know, dealing with, you know, asteroids falling from space and other supervillains and monsters from another dimension. And all of those things are well beyond the scope of the mundane. So you want to give that a good amount of mathematical space. That way it's clear that even from the beginning, these things are beyond mortal ken, which is what you bound at the lowest spot. In a science fiction setting, you might kind of have a more even curve until the end, right? Towards the end of the journey, where you start reaching the unknowable immense powers of the cosmos, right? So you might have it be like, oh, it's all understood and it's all within the realm of human understanding until you get out there, until you push to the boundaries of the game towards its ends, where things get really crazy. So the numbers really go off the end of the chart, and you start dealing with cosmic entities that are way beyond, you know, what anyone else can deal with. You wouldn't want those at low level because it makes the setting feel too out there, right? But it depends on how you want that to work. Maybe that is the direction you want to go. I think in a fantasy setting, which is what I'm most familiar with, what probably many of you are as well, you might want a slightly harder curve out of low levels to kind of represent leaving the mundane world behind. Not as harsh as in a superhero world, but then you probably want it to kind of plateau and be even. And that's kind of the interesting thing about these formulas, is they don't have to be straight lines. They can kind of move and curve depending on the stages of the game, right? So in a fantasy game, it might start with a bit of a steep curve, then kind of level out a bit. And that says that you've kind of left the mundane behind, but now you're in kind of a more even playing field and curve in kind of this fantastical world. It could then rise back up again at the end when you start dealing with truly titanic threats and powers, right? You know, you get up to the point where you start treating with other gods and stuff, and those numbers go off the end of the chart pretty quick. So, on the other side, you have what you give the characters to deal with that environment. And this isn't the sort of thing where you just match the curve. That doesn't necessarily give you the right feeling that you want. You might want them to stutter and stall at various spots, because that gives them a different impression about how they are responding to the world, that they have a threshold they have to cross, or that they finally made that threshold and they blow past it and now are on a whole new plane, right? So how their numbers scale speaks to that as well. Giving them an awful lot really quickly, even at the start, makes them feel super heroic, right? You make them feel like really truly powerful. They leave behind kind of the ordinary baseline of the world very quickly. But you can't keep on that climb, right? You have to kind of level things out here and there. If you just keep on that climb, you end up with numbers in the stratosphere, or pieces that no longer are relatable. There's no context because you're always just going in one direction. You can also keep the pace really low. You can have the world itself be this kind of fantastical, crazy place, but the world, the player's power curve itself is relatively slow and metered. You find this most often in horror games, where the players don't have a power curve at all, practically. They are ordinary. They are usual, and the world around them gets kind of crazier and crazier, and they have to come up with bigger and bigger ideas to even have a chance to stay alive. It kind of ratchets up the pressure. I think most games, most fantasy games, right, they once again are trying to take a measured approach. They kind of keep a more even pace throughout a character's career. But once again, you're going to have stutters and slowdowns where you want the game to have barriers and boundaries. When you transition from being, you know, kind of the I'm basically a farm kid with a sword to I'm an accomplished adventurer who can, you know, take risks to I am a renowned hero, right? Those are kind of phase changes, and oftentimes those are represented by various gates that unlock in math. In any game, the way that you approach this is that you build kind of a sample of what you think it should be. You kind of take your best guess. You build your curve for the world, you build your curve for players. These curves shouldn't really match, but they shouldn't be too far off from each other either, depending on the type of game experience you want to have, right? I mean, you could build a superheroes game where the characters become superheroes right away and are just crushing, you know, bank robbers and, you know, petty human threats on a regular basis for some part of the campaign. As they grow in power, you let them kind of flex. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Letting them kind of flex for a bit. But you don't want to stay in that, right? You want to let the other part of the formula catch back up, and you want to introduce super villains and super threats, right? That way they can start to feel challenged again. There's only so much that you can allow a player to just kind of run rampant over the system before they lose interest, right? If they're constantly not really facing any threats, then what's the point? You know, you can go back to my death and dying video if you want to hear more about that. But as you start building these things and as you start putting these things together, the best thing you can do for your game is test it. Get it out there. Get people to play it. Get their experience. Let them kind of deal with the progression over time, and let that speak to what your game is actually feeling like. How that they can give you their impression of what that is. They may not recognize that it's the math changing that's giving them their feeling, but they can certainly tell you about how the game made them feel. You're going to end up having to make changes, right? I think anybody who's paid attention to any of the playtests we've done knows that getting the math right is a very tricky business, and we'll keep tinkering with it and adjusting it all throughout the cycle. It's a critical part of making a game work. I'd give you one piece of advice, though, that's really important. When you are tinkering with math formulas, it's best to tinker with them one at a time. Don't tinker with all of them. If you tinker with all of them, you've just reset yourself to a new base. You can't really see the effect of one change when you make multiple changes at the same time. It's best to kind of keep your changes in limited scope. That way you can see how that change expresses itself, and then decide if you need to make more, or maybe pull back from the one you just made. It's easier to do that. If you change both things simultaneously, it becomes kind of impossible to track which one was doing what. You know what the result of those two changes are, but you don't know which one contributed what component necessarily. Sometimes that can be really opaque, and it's best to kind of take it one measured step at a time. So it takes time to get all of this right. I think that's important for any game designer to understand. You need time and you need iteration. When you're working with the math formulas of the game, iteration is your friend. It gives you steps in progress to show you kind of where you've been and where you need to go. It allows you to track trends. But the end result of the time you sink into this is really going to pay off when you can find a way to make that math match the way you want your game to feel. Well, I think that's about all I have on this topic right now. I could go into deeper examples, and if you're interested in seeing kind of more concrete examples of how this comes into play, leave me some notes about that down in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want to get more content like this. We just broke 500 subs on the channel, and I'm looking forward to creating a series of GM tips and advice. Still trying to decide on the name, but you can expect to see those here sometime in the next week or two. I need to get a couple things in place before I'm ready to start those. So hang tight, and I'll be talking to you about all my tips and advice for how I GM games. Now get out there and make some great games.